Hi guys. So in this lecture we will understand what are different type of triggers those are present in WPF. Now in my previous lecture I have explained you what are WPF triggers. So let's revise. Triggers are something which bring the static properties of style into dynamic form. So there are basically three type of triggers in WPF and let's look into one by one. So these are three type of triggers: property triggers, data triggers, and event triggers. Now I have listed the definition of all these triggers one by one, and the definitions are also self-explanatory. So the example what we have followed in my previous example was the example of a property trigger, and this is also very, or we can say this is the most common form of trigger that is being used in WPF. So let's look into the definition of property trigger. So as I've told you, this is the most common type of trigger. With a property trigger, if the condition is true, that corresponding setter elements are executed to set one or more element properties. And property value returns to original value once that condition becomes false. So let's move back to Visual Studio. And this is the same example what I have followed in my previous example. So you can see these foreground and font weight properties are properties which are related to the button class. Okay, and these properties, when the condition of the trigger is true, they are changed to red and extra bold. Okay, and when this condition becomes false, that is when I take the mouse out of that button, this condition again becomes false and this foreground and font weight properties return to their original values. So this is called property trigger. That is, we are affecting the properties of a control. So let's move back. So I guess property trigger is clear to you. Now next comes is data trigger. Now as you have seen that property triggers works with dependency properties. That is, those dependency properties provide automatic change notification when that property becomes true and false. But what if the property what I am working is not a dependency property? So in that case we use data triggers. So as it's defined in the definition, data triggers works by creating a binding to a regular property which is then monitored for changes. So it does not work with dependency properties. Say suppose you need to uh, bind two controls with each other, then you need to use data triggers. So let's look into this example and let's move to Visual Studio. Now let's change this grid to a stack panel so that I can stack two controls together. Okay, and let's give the horizontal alignment to center and vertical alignment also should be center. Okay, so my control has come to center, sorry. Now let's paste a checkbox. Okay, so I have a checkbox whose name is chk box and the content is check me. Okay, now let's try to run this application and show you that what I'm trying to achieve through this application. So here is a checkbox. Okay, and you can see my button is behaving as it was behaving in my previous example. So when I hover the mouse, it changes the appearance of this button. Okay, but I don't want now to change the appearance on the hover of the mouse. I want to do as soon as I check this checkbox. Okay, so this is done with the help of data triggers because I am binding this checkbox with this button. Okay, so for that I need to use data triggers. So you can see my previous example is working on this principle mainly because the properties is mouse over and the value is true. So I need to somehow attach my checkbox with this trigger, and I have told you that I can do this with the help of data trigger. So let's change this to a data trigger. Okay, and as soon as we have changed this to data trigger, you can see I have got an error. It says the member property is not recognized or it's not accessible. That's because data trigger does not work with dependency properties, it works with normal properties. Okay, so what I need to do is I need to bind the property of checkbox with this data trigger. So for that I need to use binding element. Then I will say binding element name, and the element name is checkbox. So I will paste my element name here, and then I will give a path that what I need to do with the action of this checkbox. So I will write is checked. Okay, so whenever this checkbox is checked, I will fire this data trigger and the value will become true whenever this checkbox is checked. And whenever this checkbox is checked, the value will become true, and then this will change these setter properties. Okay, so I hope you understood. So let's try to run this application now. And you can see now when I hover the mouse, my button is in the original state. That is, it is not changing. Those triggers are not firing. These triggers are not firing by mouse hover because I've changed the property is mouse over that was defined in my previous trigger. And then let's try to check this checkbox now. You can see my button has changed its appearance when I check this checkbox. If I remove the check, it gets back to original state because this value is become false now. So I hope you understood the concept of data triggers. Remember, data triggers does not work with dependency properties. They work with normal properties. So I am just attaching a normal control property with this control, with this button control. Okay, that is data trigger is working with data. So let's move back to our slides. So this is the definition of data trigger, and now comes the third type of trigger, which is event triggers. Now event triggers are the triggers which take part in animation. That is, if we need to do some animation in our WPF screen, we use event triggers. So I have not covered animation yet in WPF tutorial, so we will look into event triggers in a great detail when I cover the topic of animation in WPF. For now, we just need to look at example of event triggers. The reason why I am explaining you about animation concept is because there will be certain terminologies like storyboarding, double animation, single animation, etc., which I will use in the next example. So you don't need to get confused by those terminologies, right? We will be just seeing the purpose of event triggers. So let's move back to our Visual Studio, and let me comment out this thing, the complete example, so that you don't get confused. Let me collapse it. Okay, let me have a grid in here so that my controls could be inside a grid. And then I need to have a text block inside my grid. Okay, and all my text block does is it says I am a style text block. So what I want to achieve when I put a mouse inside this text block, so this will animate my text block. That is, it will stretch and then it will contract accordingly when I remove the mouse. So basically I will be applying very simple animation into this text block. And remember, animation is achieved with the help of event triggers. So let me apply a event trigger with this text block. So let me have text block dot style. Then I should give a target type to this style. So target type is my text block. Oh, sorry, text block. And let me close this style. And then let's define a trigger with this style. So I will write style dot triggers. So I will write event trigger because I need to use event trigger inside my text block. So I will give event trigger, and then routed event should be mouse enter. So I will explain you the concept of routed events in my coming up lectures. And then I need to define the actions for this event triggers. And inside these actions, we will begin the storyboard. Okay. So begin storyboard. So now what this begin storyboard does, so whatever the animation you define in your event trigger, it comes inside this storyboard. Okay, you can understand this thing as every animation has a story defined in it, so that story comes inside this begin storyboard. Okay, so inside this I will write a storyboard. So I will give double animation. It is also a kind of animation thing, so we need to, if we need to achieve the animation, we need to define what type of animation we need. Okay, then I will have the duration of my animation, for what duration I need the animation. So I will give the duration, and it is in hours, minutes, seconds and milliseconds format. And then we will give the storyboard dot target property, which property we need to change during this animation. So we need to change the font size of my text block. Okay, so at what till what size you need to change it, so we will give a 30 pixels. So let's close it. So we have closed our table animation. And why I don't get a my markup gap back? Okay, so I guess I have not closed my text block yet. So let me see. Yes, so I get my text block back. So this is how I define a animation with the help of event triggers. So let's try to run this application. You can see I have got my text block, and whenever I am entering the text block, its size is changing. But what happens if I leave this text block? It remains in the same size. But I don't want this. I want this text block to return to its original size once I leave this text block. So why it's not working properly? That's because we have defined a routed event of mouse enter. We need to define a routed event for mouse leave. Okay, so whenever we need to leave the mouse, whenever my mouse leaves from that text block, what event you need to fire? So we have not defined that event. So let me copy this event trigger, and after this event trigger I need to paste the same trigger once again. Okay, and then I need to just change the property or its size to 18, and this one to mouse leave. Okay, so it's basically the code repetition. I have pasted one another event trigger to handle my mouse leave. Now let's try to run this. You can see it's working properly. I'm entering the text block, I'm leaving the text block, and it's animating. So it's a very simple animation, and this is achieved with the help of event triggers. So I hope the concept of event trigger is also clear to you. Okay, so let's move back to our slides, and you can see the definition of event triggers also. So what are the types of triggers in WPF? Those are property triggers, data triggers, event triggers. Property triggers are the normal triggers which are widely used in WPF. Okay, and they work with dependency properties. Data triggers are the triggers which does not work with dependency properties. They work with normal properties and also with data. So if we need to attach two controls with each other, we use data triggers, and for the purpose of animations we use event triggers. So I hope the concept of all these three triggers are clear to you. Thank you so much guys for listening. If you have any doubt, please leave a comment below, and please do subscribe to my channel. Thank you so very much.